Hey toy fans, Scott Toy Guru Neitlich here from Spectre Creative, and if you're on this channel and you're not here for hieroglyphics or cute cat videos, you're probably more likely here for action figures. Because, well, we all love action figures, and that's mostly what this channel's about. And, well, a lot of what comes with action figure collecting is defining what an action figure is. Does it have molded hair? Does it have rooted hair? Can it hold something? Does it grip? Does that differentiate it from a doll? There's been a lot of debate about this, both on these videos, on my comment section, and, well, all over the web. I mean, does an action figure have to be articulated? Does it have to have a, removable helmet or a shield or an accessory? Does it need a built-in mechanism to have some kind of what's called an action feature? Well, these things aren't, or rather don't have an exact answer. And if you look back historically at the creation of toys, they go back not just decades or centuries, but even millennia. Back in ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, there were what could be called action figures. I mean, there were things that moved, that had wheels, or were vaguely human-shaped. Some even could be defined as dolls being made of cloth, a lot of them being made of just metal and or even rock. But toys they were, and toys is what museums call these things. And some of them did have, movement. Some of them could move around, but they weren't really articulated. And that's what's going to bring us to our video today. When in the history of toys did we first get what could clearly be called an action figure, and likewise the playset? So looking at more modern examples, moving from stone to metal and plastic, well, plastic's not really till the 1960s, obviously metal soldiers throughout the last 2 centuries were very big with kids, and today are still big with a lot of collectors, but these had no movement. They were pre-posed figures. Posability and movement did come in the 1800s in the form of wind-up toys, but the movement was limited to a predetermined function, such as this clown beating on a drum. It could beat on the drum all day long, but that was all it was going to do. Well, that changed when this man came along. This is Albert Schoenhut, Schoenhut. I really hope my German pronunciation is doing him justice. Albert Schoenhut? Schoenhut. I know, with a name like Neitlich, you'd think I'd be better at this kind of stuff. So he came from a long line of toy makers. Both his father and grandfather in Germany ran very successful toy making companies. And by toy making, I'm referring to things like this, like wooden painted objects that were really, had limited movement. When he came to America in the very late 1800s, he opened up in Philadelphia one of the country's very first toy manufacturers, a company that was just dedicated to making playthings. And some of the objects they made were existing playthings. They were very big into making dolls, and they were also really big into musical instruments. In fact, a Schoenhut piano is one of the most well-known play child pianos of all time. In fact, they still produce these with that name. They became sort of the definitive kids piano of the time. And you didn't have a playroom if you didn't have a Schoenhut piano in your play area for your kids. It was kind of a must-have. Play was limited to things like toy soldiers, dolls, and musical instruments. And of course, in modern times, the ones that we get are still with the same quality, and the name recognition that goes back now over 100 years has only added to the brand recognition as far as toy pianos are concerned. Now, one of the things that was around before Albert Schoenhut was the dollhouse. But the dollhouse before him was much more of an art form than a play object. In Victorian times, dollhouses were created more to act as miniature representations, often of the owner's actual home. They would want to recreate their house in miniature form, down to dolls representing their family, down to their specific dishes and furniture. it wasn't really as much of a plaything for children as much as it was for adults who enjoyed miniatures and enjoyed recreating reality in very small form. So we had doll houses, but when you say a dollhouse today, you really think much more of a kid's playhouse where they're going to move dollies or figures or, I mean, heck, the sailboat from HasLab is in a way a boat-shaped dollhouse. And speaking of boat-shaped dollhouses, one thing that can be shown as a toy was the large number of Noah's Ark play sets that came out in the 1800s. But these weren't really play sets in the sense that none of the animals had articulation. They were all usually made of wood or possibly metal. And you could put them on top of the ark, but that was about it. The ark didn't really open. It was much more of a teaching tool, and at least by offering animals and people figurines, you could have some limited play. There were a lot of different versions, but we're still not in an action figure or a playset. And as I noted earlier, all of the toy soldiers that were out were really all pre-posed, so they weren't true action figures as much as today what we would call a slug figure. There were versions that looked like celebrities and looked like real-life people, much like we have likeness rights with figures today, but again, without articulation or without playsets, you're not dealing with action figure play. So, how did this come about? Well, the other key ingredient is, in a way, this gentleman, which you may recognize. This is P.T. Barnum, which, if I put him in conjunction with this image, now you probably know just what I'm talking about. So P.T. Barnum, one of America's most eccentric idea men, was one of the creators of both the Novelty Museum and the Circus. The circus back in the 1800s was a lot different than it is today. Actually, I don't even know how much of a circus we even have today. Do kids still go to the circus? I know we're not going to get into controversies over circus closures, but the point is, in the 1800s, the circus was the equivalent of not just going to the movies or going to the fair, but it was almost like going to Disneyland, because it was a magical place where you could see animals and clowns and magicians and all sorts of things you'd never seen in your small hometown. And this was the inspiration for Albert Shaunett to create the very first true action figure and playset toy line. So, dubbed Humpty Dumpty Circus, the toy line included wooden and metal figures that had full articulation. I mean, we're not talking Marvel Legends here, but you could pose them and they could hold their pose because they were actually jointed. And the joints used very similar mechanisms to what we have today in action figures. Not only did he create figurines, but there were also animals, there were little accessories, chairs, things for them to jump through, ladders, and most importantly, this was the very first time that any toy line created what we would look at as a playset. So not only did you get the figurines, but you had basic action features. You had teeter-totters that went up and down, and figures that had joints at the knees, at the elbows, at the shoulders, so they could all interact with each other. One figure could be posed with another on top or next to him. Characters could actually ride the animals, and you also had the opportunity to not just get figures and animals, but you could buy the big top itself. You could actually buy the circus tent as a way to not just display your figures, but recreate the shows that you saw at live circuses as they would travel around the country, if you were lucky enough to have a circus come to your town. Obviously, the bigger towns, the more circuses you got. But with this being the prime entertainment of the day, if you will, the tentpole movie event, and that's where tentpole actually comes from, the fact that when tents would get put up by poles in a small town, it meant a circus was coming and something really exciting. Hence, we have tentpole movies today. So, the ability to recreate this fantasy world that you were seeing now in toy form was amazing. And we're not just talking about figures and playsets. We're also talking about mini vehicles. We're talking about carrying cases. Yep, we're talking, century before the Darth Vader carrying case. You could get it here first in the Humpty Dumpty Circus line from Albert Shaunet. By completing the entire playset, you could have a whole world. It wasn't just a single figure. It wasn't just something that was pre-posed, but for the first time, toys could truly unlock kids' imagination, and they could use these figures as avatars for the imagination, seeing themselves as the ringleader, the clown, the magician, even the animals, or just a spectator watching the circus. What's even crazier is this toy line was also the very first, I guess if you will, robot chicken execution. And by that, I mean stop-motion animation. Yes, Seth and Matt weren't the first ones to do toys of stop-motion. I mean, heck, I did it when I was a kid with a, a little family camera, but I'm not taking credit for creating it. Obviously, Matt and Seth and Robot Chicken popularized it, but Vitagraph was the first company to use action figures and toys to create stop-motion movies. So Albert E. Smith, who's pictured here, who was the lead producer, and James Stewart Blackton was the one who actually created the stop motion. And he's credited as essentially the father of all stop motion movies. Way before Harryhausen, way before Robot Chicken, these gentlemen in the late 1800s, starting off with chalk drawings that could be shot one still at a time and then morphed with both live action and new drawings, created the very first stop motion movies. And when they saw the Humpty Dumpty line of product, well, it was pretty easy to convert this into a movie. In fact, they called their movie the Humpty Dumpty Circus, naming it directly after the toy line. And the toys themselves were used in the film for stop motion. Unfortunately, this film is considered lost today, and by considered lost, I mean it is lost. We don't have an actual copy, just a few stills from both the film and the making of. But it's recognized as the first ever stop-motion movie in 1898, where they would use the Humpty Dumpty circus animals to go frame by frame, pose by pose, because they were so articulated, at least for the time. No one's going to compare it to a super articulated Spider-Man figure of today, but by shooting it the same way they shoot Robot Chicken today, one articulation move, one shot at a time, they were able to create the very first stop-motion movie using toys. Now, obviously, playsets would continue to develop past this, although it would be a couple decades till we really got another true playset. In the 1950s, we had things like grocery stores, predating that, the Lincoln Logs, where you kind of built your own, and eventually, by the late 50s, early 60s, we were getting things like medieval castles, cowboy and Indian layers, but again, with a lot of pre-posed figures. Some playsets would later incorporate vehicles, but the true playset with the articulated figure and the actual world really didn't come around until things like Mego, as well as Major Matt Mason, where you had figurines that could actually move. All of the Fisher-Price figures, again, were just slug figures. Even though there were some licensed sets, are these playsets? It's debatable, but you could definitely say by the 80s, this was the golden age of the playset. And it all started because of the articulated circus creatures created by Albert Shaunet. So while we grew up with all of these awesome playsets with articulated figures and action features, all of it spawns from the original late 1800s, early 1900s set with animals, magicians, the magic of the circus, the overwhelming enjoyment of seeing fantasy come to life, now in toy form, with fully articulated characters and an entire world. This was the first action figure, and the first action figure playset. I hope you enjoyed this video, a look back at toy history. If you'd like to see more like this, feel free to suggest a topic in the comments. I'm always looking for great ideas to do videos on, and a subscription helps tell YouTube to share this with more people. So thanks for that. I'll see you next time.